The moment of death isn't what you expect. It isn't darkness closing in or a white light beckoning. For me, it was the sound of my own ribs splintering like dry branches, and then the deafening silence of my lungs refusing to fill. I had been an engineer, a skeptic, an atheist who reduced existence to equations and evidence. I never believed in souls or afterlife, until I found myself hovering above my own body, watching doctors pound on my chest. That's when I realized the greatest irony. I had to die to discover what it means to truly live. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. When I had my experience, I was a true atheist. Not the kind who simply hasn't thought about God much, but one who had deliberately rejected the concept after careful consideration. I had built my entire worldview around observable evidence and testable hypotheses. I was an engineer by training and temperament. My mind processed reality through measurements, equations, and logical sequences. Spiritual matters seemed like pleasant fiction for those afraid to face the randomness of existence. I was working as an electrical engineer for a utility company on that fateful day. We were running behind schedule, trying to connect power lines in a new residential development before the impending storm hit. The sky was already darkening to an ominous gray when my supervisor suggested we pick up the pace. "We can skip going up and down for each connection," he said. "Just stay in the bucket, and I'll maneuver carefully around these trees." I was suspended nearly 40 feet above the ground, higher than a 3-story building. From that height, the earth below looked distant and abstract, like a model village. The metal bucket swayed slightly in the rising wind as storm clouds gathered on the horizon. I remember thinking how vulnerable we are, hanging between earth and sky by machines of our own making. My partner was more worried about electrocution than collision. He kept looking up at me and the live wires nearby, his eyes anxious beneath his hard hat. That focus on one danger blinded him to another. The bucket jolted violently as we struck a tree branch. I still remember the sound of my ribs breaking, a sickening series of cracks like dry kindling snapped over a knee, but emanating from inside my own body. The pain didn't come immediately. There were 2 seconds of perfect silence, as if my body was too stunned to report what had happened. Then it came, a tsunami of agony washing from my right side across every nerve ending. I was rushed to the emergency room, but this wasn't the end of my ordeal, only its beginning. My broken ribs weren't healing properly. Each breath became increasingly difficult, as though I was trying to draw air through a straw submerged in sand. Yet when the nurse handed me the call button, saying, "Push this if you need anything," I placed it beside me, unused. I had grown up in the South Bronx in the 1970s, where showing weakness was an invitation to be victimized. My father, a first-generation immigrant and former military man, had instilled in me a rigid code of masculinity. Men don't complain, men don't cry, men handle their own problems. I remember once at age 8 falling off my bicycle and crying. My father gripped my shoulder, his eyes stern. "Boys don't cry. Pain is only an illusion if you're strong enough to ignore it." It wasn't just my father. It was an entire culture. In my neighborhood, vulnerability was considered a fatal flaw. That mindset had saved me on the streets, but now, in the sterile confines of a hospital room, it was silently killing me. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered unpleasantly, casting a cold glow on the metal surfaces. The steady beeping of the heart monitor seemed to count down the time I had left. As my breathing grew more labored, I fought against the cultural programming telling me to stay strong. I stared at the call button, my hand inching toward it, then pulling back. "I can handle this," I told myself. I always do. For 45 excruciating minutes I waged this internal battle until finally, when my lips were likely turning blue and my vision narrowing, I pressed the button. The nurse entered, took one look at me, and immediately hit the code blue alarm. That was the beginning of my experience of dying. Dying, I discovered, is not a singular moment but a process, a sequence of physical sensations and emotional states that unfold with surprising clarity. As the medical team rushed into my room, I found myself hyper-aware of everything around me. Each breath I attempted felt like pulling air through submerged concrete. My lungs struggled to expand, but the broken ribs were like daggers stabbing into each muscle fiber. I could feel the individual alveoli in my lungs collapsing, desperate for oxygen that couldn't reach them. My heart hammered against my chest wall, an engine revving but going nowhere. The room filled with medical personnel moving with practiced urgency. They cut away my hospital gown with frightening efficiency, attaching electrodes and inserting IVs. My first emotion was an overwhelming sense of shame. A primal, visceral reaction to being suddenly exposed. I felt like a child, helpless and stripped bare before strangers. The hospital's air conditioning raised goosebumps across my naked chest as they prepared the defibrillator. This shame quickly transformed into concern for my family. I had 2 children and a wife who depended on me. I was the primary breadwinner, the problem solver, the steady hand. Who would maintain the house? Who would pay for college? Who would walk my daughter down the aisle? The practical engineer in me was calculating the financial and emotional deficit my absence would create. Then came an unexpected impulse: bargaining. I, who had dismissed religion as wishful thinking for decades, found myself negotiating with whatever might be listening. If you get me through this, I'll change. I'll be a better father, a more present husband. I'll volunteer, donate to charity, appreciate what I have. You won't regret giving me another chance. When no immediate miracle occurred, anger surged through me. I knew it, I thought bitterly. There's nothing out there listening. No cosmic plan, no divine intervention. The absence of response confirmed what I had always believed. We are alone in an indifferent universe. This anger gave way to something far worse: pure existential terror. As an atheist, I had always conceptualized death as simple non-existence, like turning off a light switch. But faced with its imminent reality, this notion became horrifying beyond words. Not darkness, but the complete absence of everything, including the awareness of that absence itself. An infinite void that I couldn't even comprehend properly because nothingness can't be experienced. I felt an arctic coldness spreading through me that seemed to extend forever. I wanted so badly for someone, anyone, to hold my hand. Not for medical purposes, but for simple human connection, in what I believed were my final moments. Yet even as I gasped for breath, those childhood lessons echoed in my head. A man stands on his own 2 feet. I could almost see my father's disapproving scowl if I showed such weakness. So my hands remained rigid at my sides, my fingers curling into the hospital sheets instead of reaching for comfort. As my condition deteriorated, my senses became strangely heightened. The sound of saline dripping through my IV transformed into what seemed like raindrops on a tin roof during summer storms, distinct, musical, almost nostalgic. The wallpaper, which I'd barely noticed before, suddenly revealed intricate patterns. My vision zoomed in with microscopic precision. I could see the individual fibers in the paper, the tiny imperfections in the paint. In this heightened state, I noticed a shadow near the doorway. Not a person's shadow, but something different. It wasn't simply dark, it was as if a piece of reality had been cut away, leaving a void that light couldn't penetrate or reflect from. It remained motionless, observing. As the medical team worked frantically above me, administering drugs and attaching more equipment, I made a profound realization. My life had been difficult in many ways. Growing up in poverty, fighting for education, working 80-hour weeks to build a career. Perhaps it was okay to let go, not as surrender or weakness, but as acceptance of natural limits. We engineer structures to withstand specific pressures, but every material has its breaking point. Perhaps this was mine. It's okay, I thought. It's okay to die. The moment this thought formed in my mind, the shadow moved. It glided around the medical team with impossible fluidity, as though operating on different physical laws. Then, I felt it reach for me. The shadow's touch began at my toe, a light pressure that wasn't physical in any conventional sense. It didn't come from outside pushing in, but seemed to originate from within, like a gentle electric current activating every cell, awakening them from their fear and reminding them they were once part of something much greater. The sensation traveled upward, and with it came the most profound transformation. The excruciating pain that had defined my existence moments before simply evaporated. My labored breathing ceased to be a struggle. The fear, the anger, the desperation, all dissolved, replaced by something I can only describe as bliss. Not happiness, which is a reaction to circumstances, but a fundamental state of being that existed independent of any external condition. I felt a warm breeze, though the hospital room had been climate-controlled and still. This wasn't air movement, but something more elemental. As if the particles around me were vibrating at a frequency that created the sensation of gentle wind. I imagined my hair flowing in this ethereal current, a thought that seemed strangely amusing in the moment. Then came the lifting sensation. I wasn't pulled or pushed. Rather, I became less dense, less bound by gravity's insistence. I rose with the natural buoyancy of a helium balloon released from a child's hand, until I found myself in the upper corner of the room, near where the walls met the ceiling. From this new vantage point, I observed the medical team working on my body. Their movements now seemed choreographed, a dance of urgency performed countless times. A female doctor straddled my body, performing chest compressions with mechanical precision. Her face showed intense concentration, beads of sweat forming at her temples, despite the room's coolness. Her eyes revealed the strain of fighting against mortality's pull. Looking down at my own body was surreal beyond words. My skin had taken on a grayish-blue tinge. My chest rose and fell artificially with each compression. My face, relaxed in unconsciousness, looked younger somehow, the worry lines that had become permanent fixtures over years of stress temporarily erased. That's me, and I'm dead, I thought with surprising detachment. Then came the logical follow-up. But if that's me, then who am I? This philosophical quandary, the mind-body problem that philosophers have debated for centuries, was no longer abstract but immediate and personal. I had no mirror to see my current form, no way to understand what I had become, yet I existed as a conscious, observing entity. A voice beside me interrupted these thoughts. Though I couldn't see anyone, the presence felt distinctly feminine, not in physical attributes, but in its essence and energy. Think of your body as a car. Now, the voice said with gentle clarity, that car has about 5 million miles on it, and there's nothing we can do to fix it anymore. You need to say goodbye to your body now. The analogy resonated with my engineer's mind. We discard tools when they're worn beyond repair. We trade in vehicles when maintenance no longer suffices. My body had been a vehicle for consciousness, nothing more. Yet what happened next surprised me. Looking at my battered, dying form, I experienced something completely unexpected. Profound gratitude and appreciation. Throughout my life, I had focused on my body's limitations. Not fast enough, not strong enough, not healthy enough. I'd berated myself for every perceived imperfection, from receding hairline to expanding waistline. Now, seeing this vessel that had carried me through 4 decades, I felt overwhelming love for it. This body had allowed me to experience the entire spectrum of human sensation. The taste of my wife's homemade bread, the smell of rain on hot pavement, the touch of my newborn daughter's hand around my finger. It had healed from injuries, fought off diseases, worked 14-hour days without complaint, and been the instrument through which I experienced every moment of joy and pain. It's time for us to move on, the feminine presence said, and somehow I knew we were about to begin a journey. We began walking, though walking isn't quite right, as I had no awareness of legs or physical movement in the conventional sense. It was more like a mutually understood progression toward somewhere else. The hospital room began to fade like a photograph left too long in sunlight. Ahead appeared what I can only describe as a massive hole in the ground, a perfect circle of absolute darkness that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. It wasn't merely black, it was an absence, a void that hurt my consciousness to look at directly. We need to go through it, my guide explained without words. Somehow I understood that this was a threshold, a boundary between states of being. As we approached and then entered this void, I experienced falling, not the terrifying fall of nightmares, but a controlled descent. During this journey downward, I felt as if layers of myself were being peeled away. It wasn't painful physically, but each removal felt like losing a garment I'd worn so long I'd forgotten it wasn't part of me. First went professional identity, engineer, manager, colleague. Then family roles, father, husband, son. Then deeper constructs, man, American, educated, atheist. Each label, each self-definition sloughed off until I felt increasingly lighter, freer. This falling seemed eternal, Yet when it finally ended with what I perceived as hitting bottom, I felt strangely reduced yet more authentic than I'd ever been. As if I'd been distilled to my essential nature. The first thing I perceived in this new realm was color. Not a specific color from the spectrum we know, but color itself as a living entity. This wasn't pigment reflecting light. This was color as a conscious, vibrant force. It moved with purpose and intelligence. The closest analogy might be watching the northern lights, but imagine those lights were sentient, communicative, and existed in dimensions beyond the three we perceive. The color spoke, not with a single voice, but with millions simultaneously. The sound resembled static or white noise, yet contained patterns my consciousness began to decipher. It wasn't language as we understand it, but direct transmission of meaning that bypassed the need for words. Then, like a curtain drawing back at a theater, the color parted to reveal a landscape of impossible beauty. A forest stretched before me, but each tree seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Mountains rose in the distance, their contours sharper and more defined than any earthly range. I could see the shadow patterns cast by clouds with perfect clarity, the interplay of light and darkness creating a living tapestry across the slopes. Herds of animals I couldn't identify moved across vast meadows, their movements synchronized like schools of fish. Everything seemed connected by invisible threads of energy. Plants, animals, rocks, clouds, all in constant communication through these luminous filaments. I discovered I was floating above this scene, and with that realization came the exhilarating understanding that I could fly. Not with wings or mechanism, but through intention alone. The thought of movement became movement itself. "Oh my God, I'm flying!" I exclaimed in delight. "That's normal here," my guide responded with gentle amusement. I soared over this landscape, experiencing a freedom unlike anything physical embodiment had ever allowed. There was no resistance, no effort, no limitation. I dove toward the ground and pulled up smoothly, twisted in aerial spirals, and floated motionless when I wished to observe. Rising higher, I could see snow-capped peaks below me, their crystalline whiteness more brilliant than anything I'd ever witnessed. Higher still, and the entire vista expanded to reveal a horizon that curved in ways that suggested this realm operated under different geometric principles than Earth. Looking toward what seemed like east, though directions felt arbitrary here, I beheld the sun, but not as the distant yellow disk we see from Earth. I perceived it as a scientist might, with advanced equipment, seeing solar flares erupting in magnificent arcs, the surface roiling with nuclear reactions, the core pulsing like a heart. Yet I could look directly at it without discomfort. I understood instinctively that the warm breeze I'd felt since leaving my body originated from this cosmic furnace, that its energy was what allowed me to fly, to exist in this form. The colors here weren't limited to the visible spectrum I'd known in life. New colors, impossible colors that had no names, filled spaces between the familiar ones. Sounds had texture and taste. Light had weight and melody. My consciousness expanded to process these synesthetic experiences as if I'd always been capable of them, but had forgotten until now. It was during this ecstatic exploration that I looked down and noticed something peculiar on a shoreline below. A cove of breathtaking beauty with crystalline water lapping against pearl-white sand. There stood a man with 7 children arranged around him like satellites. Curiosity drew me downward toward this tableau. As I descended, I noticed the man stood knee-deep in water of impossible clarity, so transparent it seemed both present and absent simultaneously. 6 children held his right hand in a chain, while a single child clung to his left. Their laughter carried upward, musical and pure. I hovered about 15 feet away, observing without immediately recognizing. The man turned his face toward me, and the shock of recognition nearly caused me to lose my newfound equilibrium in this weightless state. It was my father. My father had died 3 years earlier from complications of alcoholism, his liver finally surrendering after decades of abuse. Our last conversation had been an argument about money he'd borrowed and never repaid. We hadn't spoken again before his sudden hospitalization and death, leaving a void of unresolved tension between us. Seeing him now not as the gaunt, jaundiced figure in the hospital bed but robust and clear-eyed as he'd been in his 30s, I felt a complexity of emotions surge through me. Love, resentment, longing, anger, grief. The children I somehow knew represented versions of myself and my siblings at different ages. My father and I had a relationship fraught with conflict. He had emigrated from Puerto Rico as a teenager, served in Vietnam, and returned with shadows he drowned in alcohol. His conception of manhood was rigid, forged in poverty and hardened by war. Vulnerability was weakness, emotion was failure, nurturing was woman's work. He taught through criticism and occasional violence, believing he was preparing us for a harsh world. As a child, I both feared and idolized him. As an adolescent, I began to challenge him. By adulthood, I had become my mother's defender against his drunken rages. Our relationship cycled through periods of tense truce and explosive confrontation. I cannot recall a single instance where I told him I love you or heard those words from him. Hugs were forbidden as sissy stuff. Approval came in the form of a grunt or slight nod. Now, standing in this otherworldly cove, my father looked at me with eyes that held none of the judgment or disappointment I'd grown accustomed to seeing. Instead, they contained something I'd glimpsed only rarely in life, a profound tenderness. When he smiled, I experienced something beyond vision. I didn't just see my father, I saw into him. I perceived his own childhood. The grinding poverty in rural Puerto Rico, the father who abandoned the family, the mother who worked 3 jobs. I witnessed his military service, the friends lost, the horrors witnessed, the promises made to fallen comrades. I understood his struggles with a language and culture that never fully accepted him. The shame of being unable to advance beyond factory work despite his intelligence. The fear that his children would suffer the same prejudices. In that moment, I realized that his harshness had been misguided protection. His strictness a shield he thought would armor us against a world he experienced as hostile. His alcoholism wasn't weakness, but an attempt to silence memories too painful to face sober. His inability to express love wasn't absence of feeling, but fear that tenderness would break the dam holding back his own pain. "Dad," I began, my consciousness projecting the word without speech. I never understood. But communication here transcended language. Before I could complete the thought, our consciousnesses merged. We experienced each other's lives simultaneously. Every disappointment, every fear, every moment of pride, every secret hope. I felt his regret at our conflicts alongside his fierce pride in my accomplishments. He felt my childhood longing for approval alongside my adult compassion for his struggles. Without words, I conveyed decades of unspoken feelings. "I wish you could have been gentler. I needed your tenderness as much as your strength. I became an engineer, seeking problems I could fix, because I couldn't fix our family. I pushed myself to succeed, partly hoping to finally earn your approval. I feared becoming you and sometimes saw your reflection in my own parenting." He responded not with defensiveness but with pure understanding. "I gave what I knew. I had no model for gentleness. I thought preparing you for hardship was the only gift I could offer. I was proud of you every day, but didn't know how to say it. I loved you more than I could bear to show." In this exchange beyond language, we achieved what life had never permitted: complete understanding without judgment. The reconciliation wasn't based on apology or forgiveness in conventional terms, but on perfect comprehension of each other's complete humanity. The 7 children around him, I realized they represented not only my siblings, but versions of myself at different ages. The toddler seeking security, the boy seeking approval, the teenager seeking independence, and stages beyond my current age that I had yet to experience. This profound communion might have lasted seconds or centuries. Time had no meaning here. But eventually my father's expression changed subtly, taking on a gentle seriousness. "Look," he said, "though not with words, you have to go back." His statement bewildered me. Return? To what? Why would I leave this realm of perfect understanding and boundless freedom for the limitations of physical existence? "I don't think so," I communicated. "I really like it here." The beauty surrounding us seemed to intensify as if to emphasize my point. The water crystallized into impossibly perfect facets, reflecting light in patterns physics couldn't explain. The sky deepened into colors that contained entire worlds within their hues. Even the sand beneath my father's feet seemed alive with microscopic consciousness. "No," he insisted gently but firmly. "You have to go back. It's not your time." For the first time since entering this realm, I felt resistance. Not from external force, but from conflicting desires. Part of me recognized truth in his words, but another part clung to this newfound state of being. How could I return to the constraints of flesh after experiencing this expansion? How could I face the mundane struggles of daily existence after glimpsing the interconnected perfection of everything? As this internal conflict escalated, I felt an unexpected tugging sensation in what would have been my chest if I still had physical form. It originated from behind me, like a cord being gently but insistently pulled. The sensation was not painful but compelling, a reminder of connection to something I'd temporarily forgotten. The scenery around me began to fade, colors bleeding into formlessness. My father and the children grew transparent. I felt myself being drawn backward through space that wasn't space, down a tunnel of increasing density and limitation. Suddenly, I was aware of my body again. The weight of it, the pain of broken ribs, the harsh fluorescent lighting of the hospital room. I opened physical eyes to see the startled face of the doctor performing CPR. She jerked back slightly in surprise, her rhythm momentarily broken by my unexpected revival. But this return was temporary. Almost immediately I slipped away again, back to the cove where my father waited. The children had disappeared and he stood alone now, ankle-deep in the luminous water. "You really don't get it," he said, his expression mixing amusement and seriousness. "This isn't a choice you get to make. You're needed back there." I felt childlike disappointment. Why? What's so important that I need to return to pain and limitation? My father waded closer to me. "Your children need their father. Your wife needs her husband. There are people you haven't met yet who will need what only you can give them. Your journey isn't complete." I understood the truth in his words, but still felt reluctance. The physical world seemed so dense, so constrained compared to this realm of pure consciousness and connection. Sensing my hesitation, my father proposed an arrangement that felt both solemn and playful, a cosmic negotiation between souls. "This is what we'll do," he said. "You'll go back and complete what you need to do. Live fully, be present, share what you've learned here. And when it truly is your time, not before, I promise I will come for you myself." The offer struck me with its perfection. The engineer in me appreciated its elegant solution. Return to fulfill my purpose, with the assurance of eventual reunion. The son in me treasured the promise of my father's future presence at the most critical transition. "You'll come yourself?" I asked, seeking confirmation. "I promise," he replied with a certainty that transcended mere words. In this realm, such promises carried the weight of universal law. With that assurance, my resistance dissolved. I felt myself surrendering to the pull that had been gently insistent all along. The beautiful landscape began to recede, not fading this time, but seeming to fold into dimensions beyond perception. The last thing I saw was my father's smile. Not the rare, tight smile I'd known in life, but radiant and unburdened. Then came a sensation of rapid movement, a compression of consciousness, and finally, the heavy, confined feeling of returning to physical form. Returning to my body felt like squeezing into clothes several sizes too small after experiencing the freedom of nakedness. The physical sensations were overwhelming: pain from my broken ribs, the chill of the hospital room, the harshness of artificial light, the cacophony of medical equipment beeping and staff shouting orders. The most profound shift was the sense of separation. In that other realm, I had experienced complete interconnectedness with everything, a unity where boundaries between self and other dissolved entirely. Now, trapped again in physical form, I felt isolated, contained within the borders of my skin, disconnected from the web of consciousness I had briefly joined. "He's back," I heard someone exclaim. "We've got rhythm." The medical team worked frantically to stabilize me. I wanted to tell them about where I'd been, what I'd seen, but a breathing tube prevented speech. Perhaps that was merciful. In those first moments back, I lacked vocabulary for what I'd experienced. Recovery was slow and painful. Broken ribs take time to heal, and my body had suffered oxygen deprivation. But while my physical recovery followed predictable medical timelines, my psychological and spiritual transformation was immediate and profound. The world looked different through eyes that had seen beyond it. Colors seemed simultaneously more vivid and less important. Worries that had once consumed me, career advancement, financial security, others' opinions, now seemed trivial against the backdrop of cosmic interconnectedness I'd experienced. When my wife first visited after I regained consciousness, I took her hand and said, "I love you," something I'd grown too busy and reserved to say daily. Her surprised expression revealed how rarely I'd expressed this sentiment in recent years. I made a vow to myself then, never again would those I love question my feelings. As I recovered, I began researching near-death experiences, hungry to contextualize what had happened to me. I discovered Dr. Bruce Grayson at the University of Virginia had documented thousands of cases similar to mine. The patterns were remarkably consistent across cultures, religions, and historical periods. How could people who had never met describe such similar journeys? The engineer in me couldn't dismiss this as coincidence. I read about the neurochemical theories, that dying brains might release DMT, dimethyltryptamine, a powerful psychedelic compound that could trigger hallucinations. I considered the possibility that oxygen deprivation had created a complex fantasy from fragments of stored memories and cultural imagery. Yet these explanations felt inadequate against the vivid reality of my experience. They didn't account for the specific encounter with my father, including details of his appearance I couldn't have known. They didn't explain the profound and lasting shift in my consciousness. Most significantly, they didn't address the verified observations I'd made while supposedly unconscious. Details about the resuscitation process and conversations among medical staff that I later confirmed. I found myself in the uncomfortable position of having my worldview completely restructured. The materialist paradigm I'd embraced couldn't accommodate what I'd experienced, yet I couldn't deny the experience itself. I was left with a profound mystery that my former belief system couldn't resolve. 6 months after my near-death experience, I sat my teenage children down for a conversation I never imagined having. "I don't know exactly what happens when we die," I told them honestly. "But I know it's not nothing. Consciousness continues, love continues, connection continues. I've experienced it." My relationships transformed. I began telling my wife daily that I loved her. I hugged my children more frequently. I called my siblings regularly. Colleagues noticed I was less stressed, less judgmental. I no longer feared showing vulnerability or expressing emotion. My near-death experience had taught me that true strength isn't about suppressing feelings, but embracing them. When faced with challenges that once would have provoked anger or anxiety, I found myself responding with surprising calm. Traffic jams, work deadlines, household repairs, these minor irritations lost their power when viewed through the lens of cosmic perspective. "Will this matter when I'm looking back at my life from that shore?" became my internal barometer for allocating emotional energy. I didn't abandon skepticism entirely. The scientist in me still questions, still seeks evidence and rational explanation. But I've expanded my definition of rational to include phenomena beyond our current scientific understanding. After all, quantum physics demonstrates that reality at its foundation behaves in ways that defy classical logic. Perhaps consciousness operates by principles we've barely begun to comprehend. What remains most vivid from my journey beyond death's threshold is not the spectacular visuals or even the reunion with my father, but the overwhelming sense that everything is unfolding exactly as it should. That beneath the apparent chaos and suffering of human existence lies a perfect pattern we glimpse only in fragments during our embodied lives. The greatest irony is that I, a confirmed atheist, had to die to discover what it means to truly live. We spend our lives building walls of certainty, of identity, of control. As an engineer, I built mine with science and skepticism, dismissing the spiritual as mere fairy tales for those afraid to face reality. But when death came for me in that hospital room, those walls crumbled. As I watched doctors fight for my body from the ceiling corner, I confronted the question we all avoid. Who am I, if not this physical form? The most profound revelation wasn't seeing the beyond. It was finally seeing myself clearly. My unwillingness to show vulnerability, my resistance to asking for help, my emotional distance from loved ones. These weren't strengths, but prisons I had built, reinforced by cultural expectations of masculinity and self-reliance. It took meeting my father in that otherworldly cove to understand that what I thought was strength was actually fear. He couldn't express love in life, not because he didn't feel it, but because he was terrified of his own vulnerability. I was following the same path. Whether you believe in an afterlife or not isn't the point. The question is, are you truly living now? Are you saying I love you to those who matter? Are you asking for help when you need it? Are you wasting precious time on petty conflicts that will mean nothing when you're taking your final breath? Don't wait until you're dying to realize what matters. The most valuable currency isn't money or achievement. It's presence. It's the courage to be vulnerable with those you love. It's the wisdom to see that our connections to each other are what make us truly alive. I had to die to learn how to live. You don't have to. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.